our environment and got all the proper tools and libraries installed, and we scaffolded our project. So in this video, we're ready to begin, and we're going to start coding our project. Our project will be a very simple REST API consisting of a database of football players and their respective teams, American football players. I usually pick that because it's very easy to come up with a list of players and teams, so it's very easy to get some data in there. Our API will return data pertaining to those two what's called resources, players and teams, which is basically the types of data we will store in our database. In this video, we're going to set up the actual request structure to return that data, and that's it. So let's get started. So here is where we left off in the previous video, and here's my terminal right at the end of the deployment. I'm going to run the dev server again locally just to make sure everything still works. Okay, so here it is on localhost 3000. Excuse me. Here we go. So everything still works, and the important thing to understand here is how this request is being returned from our Node Express project. So if you look over here in the app.js, you will see that we have, towards the bottom, we have routes. We have two routes specifically, the index route and the API route. And those routes are set on lines 32 and 33. This index route is the route that's returning our home page. Now you can see the actual code for these routes in the routes directory, index and API. So our index route right here is the route currently being used to return the home page. And we have a couple other sample routes down here showing a few more sample response types. We're creating a REST API, so we want to use the API route right here. And here we have two sample what's called endpoints to handle our REST API. If you head back to the app.js, you'll see that the API route is connected through the /API path. So what that means is in order to access this route, we have to do localhost 3000 /API and then / whatever else the endpoint specifies. Now what I'm going to do here is remove all of this and start from scratch so that you can see how this endpoint is built up from the bottom up. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We have our router, which handles the request and the responses. So we take our router and we want to connect a GET request. So remember in the previous video I said there are 4 request types. Right now we're going to handle the GET because GETs are the most common and also easiest to test. The first argument, this takes 2 arguments, is the path. So we're going to do test and then comma, and then we're going to add a function argument which takes 2 arguments in itself, request and response. And the response is where we actually return data. In this case, we're going to return just some static data. We're going to return some JSON with a confirmation. And now we can test this endpoint by testing this endpoint right here, this path. Now remember, the API route itself is connected through the /API path. So in order to test the entire thing, we do localhost 3000 /API /test, and that's how that's connected. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So localhost 3000 /API /test, and we should see the JSON that we wrote a few moments ago. This is the test endpoint. This is the test endpoint. So now that we've confirmed that this works, we can use this endpoint to return data as per our REST API. So what we want to do now is define the data that we want to return. So if you recall a few moments ago, I said our REST API will revolve around 2 types of data, players and teams. And within the context of a REST API, those are called resources. Basically a data type in the database is a resource. So we have a player and a team. Those are the 2 resources we will focus on for the duration of this tutorial in our REST API. So what I'm going to do right here is create an array of players and another array of teams. And within the players array, I'm going to add a couple players, sample players from American football teams. So let's go with, let's see, first name. Okay, so here I've created my first player, and really what I'm doing here is I'm creating the schema for our player object. So a player in our quote-unquote database will be first name, last name, position, age, and team. So now that we have that set up, let's add maybe 2 more players, just so we have some more data. Okay, so we now have 3 players in our database, or well, it's not really a database, it's just static JSON right now. Eventually this will be moved over into our actual database, but right now we're just using some quick static data. So let's go ahead and also create a couple teams. So like before, what we're really doing here is we're creating the schema. We're defining the schema for the teams in our database. So I'm going to add 2 more teams. Let's see here. Patriots. The RAFC. Okay, so now that we have some fake data to work with, what we want to do is we want this endpoint right here to return this data based on the nature of the request. So what we can do here is create a team or a player endpoint, and this endpoint will now return all the players in our database. So we can just do players like that. So now if I do localhost 3000 API/player, I should see our 3 football players in our database. And then I can create another endpoint for team, which will do the same thing. So here, this endpoint right here will just return the array of teams. Whoops, teams not defined because I forgot the plural here on line 28. My apologies. So let's try that again. And here we go. Great. So now we've confirmed that the endpoints work properly. So what we want to do now is make this a little bit more general. So remember earlier I said the teams and the players are called resources. So what we want to do is combine these 2 endpoints into one endpoint and have this this part of the path defined as a variable called a resource. So what we want to do is get rid of all these actually. And we want to do router.get and then /resource. And this will specify this part of the URL as a variable. And the callback should be almost the same. So we want to extract this variable from the URL. So we want to do resource equals rec params resource. And by doing this right here on line 19, rec params resource, we are grabbing whatever the value of this string is. And if resource equals team, we send back the array of teams. Of course, if the resource is player, then we send back the array of players. So now we can combine these two separate endpoints into one that's more general using a resource variable, what's called a request parameter. And then we can use that to specify which data to return. So now if I test it over here, it should really just be the same. Now, last thing we want to do is cover for a scenario where the resource is undefined. So we have team, we have player, maybe the person mistyped it. So what we want to do is we want to do a return here. This will basically stop the request. And then here, we now want to return our first failure confirmation because this is an invalid request. So now we have player, team, and if I throw in test, it should say resource undefined. And it does. So that means our API is now starting to take a little bit more of a robust shape. We're handling some basic errors here. So now, one more thing I want to do to make this a little bit even more concise is I want to combine this data into one. So let's call it const db teams and player. So here we have a single JSON object that contains both the arrays named after the resource. Hopefully that makes sense. And then what we want to do here is we want to get the data from the DB and then we can just return like so. And then we can do that. So what we really want to do here is make sure it's defined first. If the data is undefined, now we have our error scenario. So what we want to do is we want to insert the error message right here because the database object does not contain the resource that's being specified. So that returns an invalid response, response message. Otherwise, it will return the data from the DB. And eventually, like I said earlier, all of this will be moved to an actual DB. So our resource is now better organized. So we can do player, team, and then test. And now our endpoint is much more concise and also covers the bulk of possibilities, successful scenarios as well as invalid request scenarios. So this is going to be the general structure of our GET request. So hopefully you got all that working. In the next video, we want to throw all this into an actual database right away so that we're not using fake data too much. We don't want to get in the habit of doing this too much. We're just using this to set up our endpoint structure, which we have now done. And so in the next video, we're going to get going with the actual local database, our Mongo database, throw all this into our database, and then start